And I'm delighted that Eric has joined us today, Eric Baijal of BBM Solicitors. Eric's an insolvency specialist, so has probably seen some of the results of people who didn't really know what they were getting themselves into. So welcome along, Eric. I'm delighted you've come today.
Thanks, Gary.
So just generally, by way of introduction, what are the sort of general responsibilities you take on if you sign up that thing that says, yes, director in this form goes off the company's house? What have you landed yourself in?
I mean, time doesn't let us go into a detailed analysis of all the duties of a director. If anybody's particularly interested, they can drop me an email and I'll send them a guide that everybody should read. But in the main, when somebody becomes a director, they need to remember, if it's a director of a limited company, for example, that they owe duties to that company, and by virtue of being a director, they're deemed in law to owe duties to some other people as well. Mm-hmm. Now, when that goes badly wrong and they breach those duties, some of the time it's not as bad as ending up in the jail. They might just be sequestrated and lose their house and, penniless. But
that's the good option.
Yes. So, in short, it's important that people, know what. So it's very simple duties, simple in terms of the concept, but sometimes complex in terms of how it applies. That you have to put the company's best interests first, that you shouldn't have a conflict of interest with the company. And there's a whole code effectively now under the Companies Act 2006 that directors have to obey. And the problem is, of course, we're sometimes ignorant of what these duties are.
But ignorance, of course, is no defence when it comes to the day you're standing in court.
Sadly, that's the case.
It wasn't me, boss. I didn't know what was going on.
Yeah.
So, but moving towards the sort of nub of the day here, what are the things that, it sounds pretty onerous, you've got this code of conduct, but what are the ones that people should really watch out for? I mean, they're really the ones that could end up putting them in jail.
I mean, people are surprised. There are things you can do as a director that actually mean that the keys are thrown away and you're in Porterfield or you're in Barlinnie at the end of the day. And now, without being extreme, I mean, a director can go to jail for all the same kinds of things as anybody else. So if you defraud the revenue, you'll go to jail for fraud. Uh-huh. If they have the budget to go after you potentially. But secondly, if you beat your employees up, you'll go to jail for assault in all possibility. But there's a number of particular statutory duties that result not just in personal financial liability in the way that some of the other things do, but actually result in the jail. Fraudulent trading is a good example.
So what kind of example would you give of fraudulent trading? I mean, what does it mean, and where in practical terms would it leave people?
So fraudulent trading effectively involves someone who knows that the game is up in relation to their company, that is clearly insolvent, and they keep taking the cash all the time knowing that the game's up, and usually they're trousering it. And you can go to jail for up to 10 years for that. A good example, some people might have seen in the press, was the chap down south who was running a Russian travel agency earlier on this year, who supplied high quality trips to all parts of the former Soviet Union. And it was clear probably about a year and a half ago the game was up, but he kept asking for the public's money, taking deposits on holidays, trousering large, what he called dividends, the deposits basically, and then convincing the public to postpone their trips by a few months. So obviously it was a house of cards, eventually came crashing down. He got 2 years for that.
Right, okay. And I suppose, what about people, what about the directors who maybe you get the sales and marketing director who comes along to board meetings but spends his entire life out on the road, and the finance director sitting there with the managing director going, guys, this is it. But the sales and marketing guy doesn't know, and he's going out there picking up checks. Is he equally liable?
Yeah, well, of course, sometimes we call people directors in businesses, but they're not actually legally directors. If they're legally directors of the company, and it's not just maybe the context people think, there might be people, third sector people here, or voluntary sector people who are charity trustees, and the duties are very similar, actually. But if you legally are a director of the company, while you might have a good lawyer who might, wave some mitigation around at the end of the day, say, well, he wasn't, the law deems you to have the same duties. And it's not a defence to say, oh, actually, that was all the finance director. I never bothered with the finances. Actually, that's just like shooting yourself, basically, because the whole point is that you're meant to, you have a duty, to take an interest and exercise reasonable care and skill in the running of the company.
It's interesting, I know that you're speaking about the finance director and having been in that position myself, and I'd just like to say my job title, Key Account Director. I am not a director of UHI, so don't sue me. But I know in the past, certainly, that when we took people on as directors, we gave them the guide. Yeah. And that was as much covering myself as a professional and saying, and well, we gave you the guide, you should have read it. It put you to sleep, but that's a side issue. But I think, we were talking about it before, is health and safety not a big issue as well?
Absolutely. If you're a company director and you're not concerned about health and safety, you don't know about health and safety, basically. Because every company director should be, I'm concerned to some extent about health and safety, and I run a law firm, So if you're in construction or engineering, it's a big problem. The law basically is, in very simple terms, that a company director has to take all reasonably practicable steps, and that's not defined very well in law, to ensure their employees' safety. So if you have an employee or a member of the public injured on your premises, on your job, then your neck potentially is on the line unless you can show from policy and by action that you took all reasonably practicable steps to stop it from happening. So I don't know if you saw in the press, there was a guy went to jail earlier this year down south, an MD of a roofing company, and he wasn't involved in the job as far as I can work out, but he had a team went to re-roof a factory, and the roof was a bit more fragile than they expected, a case called Arnold. And unfortunately, one of the young roofers, it often seems to happen after a coffee break or after a lunchtime, actually, these kind of accidents, people, going back to just the way it happens. And this young roofer went head first through the roof, died, unfortunately. MD went to jail for 16 months. Now, how can you stop that happening? You really have to, number A, have a policy in place about it, but B, you have to be shown to be enforcing the policy.
So just having the bits of paper there isn't good enough. Yep.
You can have the best lawyers in the world drafting the best documents, but if actually you can't prove that it's being adhered to on the ground, you have problems.
Okay. And again, you mentioned the Companies Act 2006 there. That's really the guidelines for directors. Is there anything in there that, we talk about fraudulent trading, that people would think that's kind of obvious, and yes, health and safety, if you're asking people to do things that are dangerous or letting them away with it. But is there anything nasty sitting in the Companies Act or that you wouldn't expect?
But yeah, perhaps. Apart from, to emphasise what I said earlier, people think a limited liability company means they won't be liable for anything. As I mentioned earlier, if you breach your duties as a director, then potentially you can be personally liable for all sorts of debts. But even in the Companies Act, for example, if you willfully don't lodge your annual accounts, you can go to jail for that, for 6 months or more. There's examples of people going to jail in the UK for that. Even this year, there've been somebody sent, I think, for 6 months. Again, I'm not saying they wouldn't get a chance to rectify it, but if you keep being bad enough for long enough, you'll get to jail. And a more common one that we see here is, if you're really delinquent as a director, the Department of Business will take proceedings against you, and if they prove that you have been delinquent, sometimes they get it wrong, but if they prove you've been delinquent and you don't have good enough lawyers to defend your delinquency, then you might get disqualified for up to 15 years. Now, if you continue to act as a director, not even just on the note paper, but in the shadows as a shadow director or as what we call a de facto director, that's a criminal offence. There was a chap sent to jail for 9 months earlier this year for continuing to act as a director, although he had been disqualified by the court.
So you're disqualified, you set a business up with your brother or your wife or somebody, yes. They're on the paperwork, but you're sitting at home actually carrying on as before.
They might operationally actually be running it, but it's then proven that you're sitting at home really making the decisions.
Right, okay. And then bribery is another thing that's come up recently. I know myself...
In your own personal experience?
No, I was... See how lawyers become judges. Actually, yes, because we in the business I ran, and my fellow director is in the room. We did a lot of work in the Middle East, and we were asked for commissions, and we didn't do it because we felt that our product was sufficiently. It had sufficient merit in its own right that we didn't have to do anything like that. But we knew other people who did. But I read about BAE and Saudi Arabia and understand that it's a real problem.
This is a real. This is great. It's a real money-making opportunity for lawyers, and but it's, the Bribery Act is really it's a big issue for businesses, and particularly in this room, there are people interested in taking the economy of the Highlands and Islands forward, which is excellent. And to do that, we're talking about export, we're talking about going abroad. So this is more relevant than ever. Since 2000, this Bribery Act 2010, it's now an offence, as you would expect, to offer a bribe, to receive a bribe. But what you might not know is it's also an offence to fail to prevent bribery taking place. So, for example, the example you gave, even though you were happily honest trading away, if you're a salesman that went to the Middle East and you had no bribery policies in place, and that salesman is paying passport control bribes, something as simple as that, which happens fairly routine in certain, that's why companies have to think carefully about the kind of jurisdictions they choose to operate in. There's a reason sometimes that jurisdictions are low cost. You have to measure the risks. In that example, you could be guilty of an offence. Right. You could go to the jail. So what you have to do is you need to have policies in place, and again, you need to have some way of showing that those policies are being adhered to. And it might be that you actually need audits carried out by lawyers, by auditors, depending on the risk of your business and the jurisdictions at play to ensure that it's not happening. There's a good example in Iraq, a British company called Forsyth, civil engineering business, were supplying bridge parts to Iraq. At the end of last year, I think the conviction came through, and down south again, and one of the directors got the jail for 2 years because they knew and didn't stop their salesmen on the ground offering bribes, offering kickbacks, they were calling commissions again, to Iraqi officials.
Okay, right. So you've got
happy days.
Happy days. It's getting worse. And another one that that I've heard mentioned, and I think this is a particularly Scottish thing, is culpable homicide.
Yeah. So
this sounds really bad.
So south of the border, we speak about manslaughter. So you kill somebody, but you didn't intend to murder them. And basically, I can't give you any practical example, but in theory, if you're reckless enough to kill somebody in your watch as a director, so your systems are so bad and so dangerous and so reckless, so the health and safety rules might be a guide, and they say you have to have scaffolds and hard hats and harnesses, and you just put your boys up the roof, and maybe that happens in the Highlands actually. But if you're very reckless and reckless enough, then potentially, a company director could be guilty of culpable homicide, which has a life imprisonment sentence potentially. I can't give you any practical example of that, so you can always run the risk that it won't happen, but not a good idea.
And these things which I think we've now sufficiently frightened us all.
Splendid.
And anyone who's just signed up as a director, Ewan, that are probably we got quite interested in this now. That what can people do to mitigate that? Well,
in all seriousness, a number of these things, health and safety actually, you can get very good insurance policies that take a lot of the worry away. And that's actually a good point. I'm amazed sometimes at the number of businesses that don't have really strong and robust insurances in place. That's something you should be speaking with your advisors, accountants, lawyers, looking over what your insurance broker is provided. Is it comprehensive enough to protect you against all the possible risks it could? Secondly, very basically, follow the law and don't be dishonest, which is always a good start. But that will involve, and yes, it is red tape. It will involve liaising more with your advisors, with specialist lawyers to make sure you're compliant and working out how you can implement that all in practice. People do moan about the cost of compliance, but at the end of the day, as I often point out to clients, you would far rather that we built you a fence at the top of the cliff rather than just trying to deliver the ambulance to you quicker at the bottom. You know, it's the more preventative work that can be done, and it depends on your attitude to risk. I have clients that take horrendous risks that I would never do, and they say, well, you know, I've been doing it for 20 years. I say, well, yeah, but next year might be the year it all goes horribly wrong, but they can live with the risk. Others of us wouldn't be able to sleep at night, I don't think. But it is, in short, insurance advice implementation.
Okay, that's good advice. What's the most ludicrous situation you've seen people getting into, just from your own experience?
Well, I think people tell one lie, and it snowballs. And that's true in any walk of life. One of my favourites was a double glazing company that went into liquidation in Murray. And the director said, it's an economic downturn. The orders have just fallen off the end of the cliff. Until we found out that the week before, felt sorry for them, until we found out the week before they went bust, they'd sent an email to all of their customers that their invoice saying, you see those invoices we sent you, they had the wrong bank account details on. Here's the right bank account details. You know, his wife's bank account. Or, for example, there was the construction company that went bust up north a couple of years ago now, where again we felt sorry, there just wasn't the demand for the product anymore, and they'd just run out of cash and the bank wouldn't support them anymore. Until I was asked to analyse the company Amex statements, and we found out that the director had spent about 50k taking his wife around the world on the Queen Mary on the company in the run-up to insolvency. I mean, it happens all the time. I just this very week, on Wednesday, I was drafting a letter to the director of a company that went bust in this city some time ago, but we, completed the investigation. And while they couldn't pay their suppliers, they were trousering, 70 or 80,000 pounds over, a few months, and they think so. People get themselves in ridiculous situations. The ones that end up in jail, health and safety is a bit different actually. Often they are not dishonest people. They are often people that just didn't see, they had never had the advice to realise that something was a difficulty. But the good news about health and safety is that is one you can insure pretty heavily against. You can't insure against the jail sentence, but if it's any comfort, the jail sentences only come to the people who are really reckless, and it's more likely that you'll get a significant fine, which you might be able, to insure against, providing you keep to the policies.
Okay. Very. I think we'll leave it there, folks. First of all, Eric, thank you very much. That's been brilliant.
Thank you.